There is a country in the middle of South America that almost nobody can describe. It is landlocked. It has about 7 million people. It borders Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. There is no coastline, no famous ruin on the tourist circuit, no single postcard image that fixes it in the mind. But it has one thing no other country in the Americas has. Close to 9 in 10 people here speak an indigenous language, not as a heritage exercise, not in a handful of remote villages, as the language they think in. A national household survey in 2024 put the numbers down plainly. Just under 39% of Paraguayans speak both Guarani and Spanish at home. 30% speak mostly Guarani. 28.5% speak mostly Spanish, which means the indigenous language is not the minority language here, it is the majority one. Senators campaign in it, doctors take patient histories in it, farmers argue in it, their grandchildren text in it, and the radio plays love songs in it all day long. Now the second fact. Fewer than 2 people in every 100 in Paraguay identify as indigenous. Around 20 distinct indigenous peoples live inside these borders. Together, they number a little over 100,000 out of 7 million. And many of them do not speak Guarani at all. They speak Ayoreo, or Nivacle, or Enlet. Languages with no official status, no legal protection, and in some cases, fewer than 1,000 speakers left. In the northwest, in a dry forest called the Chaco, more than 45,000 square kilometers of that land was cleared between 2001 and 2019, an area larger than Denmark, larger than Switzerland. So both things are true at the same time. The Guarani language is spoken by almost everybody in Paraguay, and the Guarani people, along with every other indigenous nation inside the country, are among the smallest and most pressured populations on the continent. The language won. The people who gave it did not. That is not how any of this is supposed to work. Everywhere else in the Americas, the arithmetic runs the other way. The colonial language spreads. The indigenous language retreats into the countryside, into the elderly, into ceremony, into memory. Quechua, Nahuatl, Navajo, Cree, each of them the language of a people, none of them the language of a nation. Guarani is the exception, and the reason it is the exception is not a policy or a preservation program or a well-funded institute in a capital city. It is something that happened to this country between 1864 and 1870, one of the worst things that has ever happened to any country, anywhere. When it was over, a census counted the survivors. 28,000 of them were men. Remember that number. So the question is a small one, and it is this. Who was left to do the talking? This is Paraguay. 2 rivers hold it together. The Paraguay River comes down through the middle from north to south. The Paraná runs along the southern and eastern edge before it turns for the sea. Everything east of the Paraguay River is green, rolling, red-earthed, and full of people. Everything west of it is the Chaco, flat, thorned, blindingly hot, and close to empty. 60% of the land is on the western side. 97% of the population is on the eastern one. In 1992, 3 years after a 35-year dictatorship ended, Paraguay wrote a new constitution and did something no other country in the hemisphere had done. It made an indigenous language co-official. Equal status, the same legal weight as Spanish. The constitution was published in both. But the law came second. The speaking came first, by about 400 years. And what people actually speak is neither language, exactly. It is a blend, and the blend has a name, Jopara. In Guarani, the word means mixture. Here is how it works. The skeleton is Guarani, the verb endings, the shape of the sentence, the way negation wraps around a word instead of sitting in front of it. The flesh is often Spanish. Nouns, numbers, anything modern or bureaucratic. A Paraguayan will take a Spanish verb, conjugated by Guarani rules, and never notice they have done it. Around a third of households talk this way most of the time. Purists on one side want the loan words stripped out and replaced with older Guarani constructions. Purists on the other say Jopara is simply what the language has become. Both arguments are, underneath, arguments about who this country belongs to. You already speak a little Guarani yourself. Most people do without knowing it. The largest cat in the Americas lives along Paraguay's northern and eastern edges. A big male can pass 100 kilograms. Its bite is the most powerful of any big cat relative to skull size, strong enough to punch through the shell of a river turtle or through the armored head of a caiman. Most large cats kill by suffocation, closing the throat. This one goes through bone. The Guarani called it jaguara. Portuguese traders took the word from them. English took it from Portuguese. Today, it sits on car badges, on football shirts, on the covers of nature magazines in 100 countries. Jaguar. There may be only a few hundred left inside Paraguay now, scattered through the northern Chaco, the edge of the Pantanal, and the last broken fragments of Atlantic forest in the east. They are protected by law and hunted anyway, mostly by ranchers who have lost calves. The word traveled the whole world. What happened to the language it came from is a longer story. Asunción sits on a bay of the Paraguay River, on the eastern bank, looking west across the water at the Chaco. It was founded on the 15th of August, 1537, 43 years before Buenos Aires, which had to be founded twice, and the second time by an expedition that sailed from here. For a while, Asunción was the most important Spanish settlement south of Peru. They called it the Mother of Cities. Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Corrientes, Santa Fe, Villarrica, all of them founded or refounded by men who left from this riverbank. And then Spain forgot it existed. There was no silver here, no gold. The rivers ran the wrong way for easy shipping, and the Portuguese held the coast. Within a century, Asunción had gone from the hinge of Spanish South America to a river town with a few hundred European men in it, and no reason for anyone in Madrid to think about it again. That neglect is the first reason the language survived. Here is the mechanism. The Spaniards who came to Paraguay came almost entirely without Spanish women. They married or took Guarani wives. The children of those unions were raised inside the house, and the house was run by the mother, and the mother spoke Guarani. A boy might learn Spanish from his father if his father stayed and if he had time. He learned Guarani from birth, from everyone, all day, in every direction. Within 2 generations, the colony was speaking the mother's language and administering itself in the father's. It has never stopped doing both. Walk through Asunción now, and you can hear the seam. In the courts, in the ministries, In the bank on the corner of Palmer Street, Spanish. Step outside onto Palmer Street and listen to the same people buy a coffee, complain about the heat, greet a cousin. Guarani. The Palacio de los Lopez stands on the waterfront, white and French-looking, built for a dictator's son who wanted a European capital on a South American river. Behind it, down the slope towards the water, is the Chacarita, one of the oldest informal neighborhoods in the city and one that floods most years when the river comes up. 15 minutes further south, the ground stops being ground. Catera is a landfill. Around 1,500 tons of Asunción's waste arrive here every day. Families live in it and around it and make their living out of it, pulling out plastic, metal, cardboard, glass, anything that can be washed and sold on by the kilo. In 2006, an environmental technician named Fabio Chavez came to Catera to run a recycling program. In his spare time, he started giving music lessons to the children of the pickers. More children turned up than he had instruments, and instruments were not something anybody in Catera could buy. As Chavez has put it, a violin here is worth more than a house. So he went to a man called Nicolas Gomez. Everyone calls him Cola. He was a waste picker who had spent 30 years in construction before he came to the dump, and he knew what his hands could do. Cola made a violin out of an oil tin, then a cello from a larger tin, a scrap of packing wood, and a discarded fork bent into a tailpiece. Then saxophones from drain pipes with bottle caps and coins for keys, drum skins cut from X-ray film. The recycled orchestra of Catera has since played in more than 40 countries. They have opened for Metallica. Chavez says the same sentence in almost every interview. The world sends us its garbage, and we send back music. The recycling program he originally came to run failed. There is a pattern in that, and it runs underneath everything in this country. What survives in Paraguay is rarely what was funded or protected or planned in an office. It is whatever was carried by whoever happened to be left holding it. More often than not, that was the mother's. Hold on to that, it becomes the whole story later. 60 kilometers southeast of the capital, at the foot of a low green hill, is a village called Yaguaron. The name is Guarani. It means, near enough, the place of the Yaguara, the place of the jaguar. The church does not look like much from the road. White walls. A wooden bell tower standing apart from the building on its own posts. A tiled roof with an overhang so long and so low that the whole front of the building sits in shade all day.
Then you go in.
1755. Franciscan friars begin work on a church at Yaguaron, and every hand that carves it, paints it, and raises it is Guarani. The ceiling goes up in cedar, cut and fitted by hand. The altarpiece climbs in tiers of gold leaf. The pulpit, the confessionals, the retablo, the saints in their niches. All of it made here, all of it colored with pigments prepared on site from earth, from plants, from crushed insects. The work takes them the better part of 20 years. What came out of it is one of the finest surviving interiors in the Spanish colonial world, and it is not quite Spanish. The vine work is not European vine work. The flowers wound around the columns are flowers that grow in this valley. The faces on the angels are local faces. The friars supplied the theology. The Guarani supplied everything you can actually see. Half an hour east of Asunción, on the old road towards the lake, is a town called Itaugua. It makes lace. Specifically, it makes ñanduti, and ñanduti is a Guarani word. Ñandu is the spider. Ti is white, spiderweb white. Here is how it is done. A piece of cloth is stretched drum-tight over a wooden frame, and the pattern is drawn onto the cloth. The weaver lays down radial threads from a center point outward, like the spokes of a wheel. Then she works circular rows across them with a needle, knotting, filling, building the motif thread by thread on top of the fabric. When the disc is finished, she cuts the fabric out from underneath it. What is left is a piece of lace held together by nothing but its own tension. Pull one thread and the geometry collapses. The technique arrived from Spain, probably from Tenerife by way of the Canary Islands, and the Jesuits spread it through their missions because they wanted lace for their altars. What Guarani and Mestizo women did with it over the next 2 centuries turned it into something else entirely. Around 300 named motifs, most of them taken from whatever grows, crawls, and flies within walking distance. In 1870, at the end of the war, Itagua was effectively gone. The town had been emptied. Almost nobody came back. One weaver did. She started it again. The women who learned from her taught their daughters, and those daughters taught theirs. And today, the second Sunday of October, is National Nyanduti Day. The town holds a festival. The lace is in museum collections in Europe, in shop windows in Asuncion, and on the skirts of every folk dancer in the country. Nobody recorded her name. That is not unusual in this story. Most of the people who saved things in Paraguay were women whose names were never written down. The spider the lace is named for is real and worth a moment. Golden silk orb weavers build across gaps in the forest here, between trees, over paths, across small streams. A single web can span more than a meter. The silk is gold, not gold tinted in a certain light, actually pigmented, and she adjusts the shade to the sight. In bright patches, she turns the gold up, because bees fly into what looks like a shaft of light. In shade, she dials it down until the web disappears against the dark. The dragline silk absorbs more energy before it breaks than steel or Kevlar of the same weight. She rebuilds the sticky spiral almost every day and eats the old one to recover the protein. The weavers of Itagua never needed any of that explained. They watched the thing going up outside the door every morning, and they copied the only structure they had ever seen that holds itself upright by pulling evenly in every direction at once.
20 minutes further on,
the road reaches water. Lake Ipacaray is shallow, warm, and 30 kilometers around, and the 2 towns on its shore has been the country's summer escape for a century. Aragua, on the western side, all cobblestones and strawberry stalls and ceramic workshops, and San Bernardino on the eastern, founded by German settlers in the 1880s, and still, on a January weekend, the loudest place in Paraguay. 50 kilometers east of the capital, in the hills of Cordillera, is a small town that takes more visitors in a single week than the rest of the country manages in a year. Every December, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people walk to Cacupe. Many of them walk through the night. Some walk for 3 days. They come to a basilica to stand in front of a wooden statue of the Virgin Mary, about half a meter high. The story attached to it is a Guarani one. A convert named Jose, hiding from a war party, presses himself against a tree and promises the Virgin that if he lives, he will carve her image out of it. He lives. He carves 2 figures from the same trunk, and the smaller one is the figure in the basilica. Now listen to what 1 million people call her when they pray. Tupasi. Tupa, in pre-contact Guarani belief, was bound up with thunder, a presence in storms, a force in the sky. When the missionaries needed a word for God, that is the word they took. And when they needed a word for the Mother of God, they built one out of tupa and si, the word for mother. Tupasi, God's mother. The most Catholic object in Paraguay is addressed by more than 1 million people every December in the vocabulary of the religion Catholicism came here to replace. How does something like that happen? Not by accident. Somebody decided it, deliberately, 350 kilometers south of here, and then they wrote it down. In the far south of the country, in the department of Itapúa, red earth roads run off the highway between soy fields towards 2 sets of ruins about 10 kilometers apart. La Santísima Trinidad de Paraná, Jesus de Tavarangue. They are what is left in Paraguay of 30 settlements the Jesuits built across this river basin in the 17th and 18th centuries. 7 of the 30 stood inside what is now Paraguayan territory. The rest are in Argentina and Brazil. They were called reducciones. The word does not mean what it sounds like. It referred to gathering scattered people into one place. The reason they were built matters. 2 things were hunting the Guarani at the time. The first was the encomienda, the Spanish labor system, which was slavery with paperwork. The second was slave raiders coming down out of Sao Paulo, who took Guarani by the thousand and sold them on the Brazilian coast. The missions offered shelter from both, and the price of shelter was conversion. But the Jesuits did something inside them that nobody else in the Americas did at that scale. They ran the whole operation in Guarani, not as a concession, as policy. Spanish settlers were barred from the missions. Spanish was not the working language. Mass, instruction, administration, music, law, and daily business were all conducted in the language the people already spoke. And then they gave that language the equipment of a written one. A Jesuit named Antonio Ruiz de Montoya spent years living among Guarani speakers, learning the language properly, and in 1639 he published a dictionary of it. The following year, he published a grammar and a catechism.
That is how it works.
To fix a spoken language, you need 3 things. You need a stable way of writing its sounds with the alphabet you have. You need a dictionary, so that meaning does not drift between villages. And you need a grammar, so that a stranger can learn it without a teacher. Guarani got all 3 in print before English spelling had settled. By around 1700, there was a printing press operating inside the missions themselves, the first in this entire river basin. The type was cut and cast locally. The men setting it and pulling the sheets were Guarani. They printed devotional books, grammars, and a history of the region written in Guarani by a Guarani author. Trinidad was founded in 1706 and grew into a small city. You can still read the plan on the ground. A plaza the size of several football pitches, the long terraces of family houses along its sides, workshops, a school, a hospital, a cemetery, and above it, the church. The stone carving is the thing people come for. Around the interior walls runs a frieze of angels, and each angel is playing an instrument. A clavichord, a maraca, a trumpet, a harp. The missions ran on music. The Guarani took to European polyphony so completely that Italian composers were sent out to work with them, and violins, harps, and organs were built in mission workshops. The Paraguayan harp, 36 strings, played standing, the national instrument now, comes down from those benches. 10 kilometers away, Jesus de Tavarangue was going to be bigger. Founded in 1685, moved several times, settled on this hill in 1760. The church was designed on a vast scale, with trefoil arches you will not find anywhere else in the region, a Moorish shape carried across an ocean and set down in a Guarani forest. It was never finished. In 1767, Carlos III of Spain signed an order expelling the Society of Jesus from every Spanish territory on earth. The order reached the Rio de la Plata the following year. The priests were removed under armed escort. More than 100,000 people were living in the mission towns when it happened. What follows is a chain, and each link causes the next. The Jesuits go. The administration collapses because it had all run through them. The Spanish crown hands the missions to other orders and to civil administrators who are chiefly interested in extracting labor. Within a generation, the towns empty. Within two, most of them are ruins with trees growing out of the walls. The people scatter, north into Paraguay proper, south into Corrientes, east across the river. And they take the language with them, out of the missions and into the general population, already written down, already standardized, already carrying 400 years of Christian vocabulary built out of Guarani roots. The shelter was removed. What had been built inside it walked out and kept going. Tavarangue kept its name. In Guarani, Tavarangue means something close to what was going to be a town. They named it that afterwards. It is worth remembering. 40 kilometers west, the same river runs past a city that had to move. Encarnacion is Paraguay's southern gateway, joined to Posadas in Argentina by a bridge across the Paraná. It has the biggest carnival in the country, 6 weekends of it, in a purpose-built street of grandstands. It also has beaches, long ones with white sand, umbrellas, volleyball nets, and a promenade. In a country with no sea. They exist because of a dam. The Yacyretá project downstream, built jointly with Argentina, raised the Paraná and drowned the low half of the old city. The port, the market, the railway station, thousands of houses. The people were moved uphill, and the government built a new waterfront along the higher line, trucked in sand, and turned a displacement into a resort. On a January afternoon, there are 10,000 people on that sand, most of them speaking Guarani, on a beach that exists because the river was raised over the neighborhood their grandparents lived in. North of the beaches, the country goes quiet and green, and something is moving through the long grass with its nose to the ground. The giant anteater can reach more than 2 meters from snout to tail tip. It has no teeth. Its skull is fused into a rigid tube, and its tongue, 60 centimeters of it, is anchored not to the jaw, but to the breastbone. Here is how it feeds. The tongue is coated in sticky saliva and covered in tiny backward-facing spines. It goes into a termite mound and comes back out up to 150 times a minute. The animal takes what it can get in about a minute and then leaves, deliberately, before the soldier termites organize. That means it must raise its stomach's worth from up to 200 separate mounds a day. It eats perhaps 30,000 insects, and it does not destroy a single colony doing it. It is nearly blind, and walks on its knuckles to keep its claws sharp. Cornered, it will rear up and use them, and a giant anteater has killed a grown man. It is listed as vulnerable, and the reason is simple. It needs open ground and dense cover in the same landscape, and Paraguay has spent 50 years turning that combination into pasture and soy. Head east from here and you reach the border, and the border is where this country's strangest achievement stands. The Itaipu Dam crosses the Paraná between Paraguay and Brazil, nearly 8 kilometers long, 196 meters high, 20 turbines at 700 megawatts each. For most of the last 40 years, it has generated more electricity annually than any other power station on Earth. Half of everything it makes belongs to Paraguay by treaty, and Paraguay cannot use anything like half. It covers close to 90% of the country's electricity and still leaves an enormous surplus sold on to Brazil. Even the current has to be translated. Paraguay runs at 50 hertz. Brazil runs at 60. Half of Itaipu's generators spin at one frequency and half at the other, and a converter station on the Brazilian side turns Paraguay's surplus into something the Brazilian grid can accept. To build it, they drowned something. Upstream of the dam site, the Paraná used to squeeze from 380 meters wide down to 60 and fall through a staircase of 18 cataracts. They were called Sete Quedas, the Seven Falls, or Salto del Guaira on the Paraguayan side. By volume of water they were, by most measurements, the largest waterfall on the planet, several times the flow of Niagara. The sound carried more than 20 kilometers. Once it was known they would go, people came in their thousands to see them a final time. On the 17th of January, 1982, a footbridge over the best viewpoint collapsed under the weight of the crowd, and dozens of people died. On the 13th of October that year, the gates closed. The reservoir filled in 14 days. Hundreds of people gathered on the bank as the water rose and held a ceremony for the falls. Then, there was nothing to see. There still isn't. There is a flat lake where the loudest place in South America used to be. Downstream, where the bridge crosses to Brazil, sits Ciudad del Este, a city of duty-free arcades, money changers, and lorries, where three countries meet within sight of each other and roughly 40,000 people cross the river every single day. Turn away from the river and drive into the hills of Guaira, and the country changes texture. The Ibitiruzu range is not high. The summit of Cerro Tres Candu, the highest point in Paraguay, reaches only 842 meters. But the slopes hold something rarer than altitude. This is Atlantic forest, not Amazon, a separate biome altogether, wetter, older, denser, and far more crowded with species found nowhere else. It once ran unbroken from the Brazilian coast across southern Paraguay and into Argentina. At Salto Cristal, a stream falls 40 meters off a lip of red rock into a pool the color of green glass, and the canopy closes over the whole thing. Stand there, and it is easy to assume this is what all of eastern Paraguay used to look like.
It is.
Which raises the obvious question: where did the rest of it go? Soy, cattle, and time. Paraguay's share of the Atlantic forest has lost close to 90% of its original cover, and through the 1990s, this country recorded one of the highest deforestation rates on the planet. In 2004, the government passed a law banning the conversion of forest in the eastern half of the country. It was meant to last 2 years. It has been renewed ever since, and in the eastern region, clearing dropped by something like 90%. The law does not apply west of the river. Around these hills, the towns are old and unhurried. Villarica was founded in 1570 and then moved 7 times, chased by raiders and floods, before it settled where it is. An hour north, at Paso Yobay, men work small gold claims in the hills with hoses and hand tools, on a seam nobody thought was there until the 1990s. But cross the Paraguay River, heading west, and everything stops. The Chaco is 60% of this country and holds less than 3% of its people. It is flat to the horizon in every direction. The soil is salted in places. In summer, the temperature goes past 45 degrees and the standing water disappears, and the thorn scrub closes into something a man cannot walk through without cutting a path. The Spanish called it the Green Hell and went around it for 300 years. Everything alive out here is built for drought. The palo borracho swells its trunk into a barrel to store water and defends it with a coat of conical spines. The quebracho, the name means axe breaker, grows wood so dense it sinks in water, and its bark was stripped for a century to make the tannin that cured the world's leather. The first outsiders to settle it permanently arrived in the late 1920s, and they were Mennonites, one way from Canada, unwilling to accept English-language schooling, one out of the Soviet Union fleeing collectivization, and one from Europe after the Second World War. Paraguay offered them land nobody else wanted, and a written guarantee of their own schools, their own language, and exemption from military service. They very nearly died. The first colonists lost dozens of people to typhoid inside 2 years. Today, their 3 colonies produce most of the dairy in Paraguay. Philadelphia and Loma Plata have paved streets, cooperatives, hospitals, and air conditioning in the middle of the thorn forest. The working language on those streets is Plautdeutsch, Low German, with High German in church and Spanish at the bank, which makes the Chaco a place where a European dialect from the Vistula Delta is spoken daily, 300 kilometers from a forest where people are living who have never met a stranger. The Mennonites had barely established themselves when the war started. Bolivia and Paraguay both claimed the Chaco. Neither had ever occupied it. Geologists had suggested oil beneath it, and Bolivia, having lost its coastline to Chile 50 years earlier, wanted a river route to the Atlantic. Between 1932 and 1935, the 2 poorest countries in South America fought over the emptiest land on the continent. Around 100,000 men died, more of them from thirst and disease than from gunfire. Paraguay had 1/3 of Bolivia's population and almost no equipment. Its soldiers were nicknamed the Pata Pelada, the unshod, and carried canteens cut from cow horn. September 1932. In a forward position somewhere in the Chaco, a Paraguayan radio operator sends an order in the clear, without cipher, on an open channel that the Bolivians are certainly listening to. He sends it in Guarani. The Bolivian army was drawn largely from the Andean highlands. Its soldiers spoke Quechua and Aymara. Almost none of them had any idea what they were hearing. Paraguay won the war. It took 3/4 of the disputed territory. There was no oil. The Chaco is also where a great deal that is supposed to be gone turns out not to be. There is an animal out here that science filed as extinct for 40 years. We will come to it. Northward along the river, the settlements thin out and then stop. Concepcion is the last real city, a river port of faded arcaded buildings and a 900-kilometer road to nowhere in particular. Beyond it, Fuerte Olimpo sits under 3 limestone hills, with a fort on top of one of them. And past that, at Bahia Negra, the Chaco runs into the southern tip of the Pantanal, the largest wetland on Earth. And Paraguay simply ends in water and birds. Back in the deep Chaco, west of the Mennonite colonies, there is an area of forest carrying a long official name and a short, hard reality. It is territory claimed by the Ayoreo Totobiegosode, and inside it, somewhere, are perhaps 150 people who have never made contact with the outside world. They are the only group living in voluntary isolation anywhere in the Americas outside the Amazon. Their relatives were brought out of the forest between the 1950s and the 1980s, mostly by evangelical missionaries who used a method they described openly at the time, sending already converted Ayoreo back into the bush to find the others and talk them out. People died of respiratory illness within months of leaving. Others were resettled into permanent villages on land that would not feed them. In September 1991, a short item appeared in the back pages of a Paraguayan newspaper. A Mennonite farmer extending his cattle pasture had driven a bulldozer through an inhabited camp. The families ran. For most readers, it was a curiosity. For the Ayoreo, who had already been contacted, it was the start of 35 years of legal work. They filed their land claim in 1993. Paraguay declared the area protected in 2001. Cattle companies hold titles inside it anyway, and the clearing has continued through every court ruling, every appeal, and every international complaint. In September 2024, a fire started on cleared ranch land, burned 200,000 hectares of Ayoreo territory. So here is the shape of the thing. In a country where 9 out of 10 people speak an indigenous language, there are people hiding in the last of a forest, from bulldozers, in silence, because being found has historically meant dying of a cold. Nobody is coming to fix that. It is happening now, roughly 600 kilometers from a capital city where the courts operate in 2 languages and one of them is Guarani. The Chaco keeps its own company after dark. Something crosses the track at dusk on legs far too long for its body. A meter at the shoulder, russet red, black stockings, a mane along the neck that lifts when it is startled. The maned wolf is not a wolf, and it is not a fox. It is the only member of its genus with no close living relative anywhere, and the legs are that long for one reason: to see over grass. It walks with both legs on the same side, moving together like a camel, which is efficient and looks entirely wrong. Around half of what it eats is fruit, chiefly a tomato relative that grows out here and which depends on it, because the seeds germinate far better after passing through a maned wolf than after falling to the ground. It hunts alone. A mated pair will share dozens of square kilometers and still avoid each other most of the year, communicating by a single deep bark carried across the flats at night, and by scent marks so pungent that people who catch the smell assume somebody nearby is smoking. It cannot survive in cleared pasture. It needs the mixture, grass and thicket, open and closed, and the Chaco is being turned into one thing. To understand what happened to Paraguay, you have to know what it was first. In 1860, this was not a poor country. It was, by the standards of South America at the time, an unusually solid one.
2 men had built it.
José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia ran Paraguay for 26 years and sealed it against the outside world. No foreign trade to speak of, no loans, no influence. Carlos Antonio López followed him and opened the doors halfway. López imported British engineers. He built an iron foundry at Ibicuy, laid one of the first railways in South America, strung a telegraph line, and set up a shipyard, a newspaper, and schools. By the time he died in 1862, Paraguay had a functioning state, an army of some size, and, almost uniquely in the region, no foreign debt at all. Argentina and Brazil were both deep in obligations to London banks. Paraguay owed nothing to anyone. Then, Carlos Antonio Lopez's son took over. Francisco Solano Lopez had been sent to Europe as a young man. He spent time at the court of Napoleon III and came home with ideas. He ordered Napoleonic uniforms for his army. He commissioned a replica of Bonaparte's crown. He saw himself, and said so, as a figure of the same order. In 1864, Brazil intervened militarily in Uruguay against a government that was Paraguay's only regional ally and its only guarantee of a route to the sea. Solano Lopez seized a Brazilian steamer on the Paraguay River and declared war. Then he asked Argentina for permission to march troops across its territory to reach the fighting. Argentina refused. He declared war on Argentina too. On the 1st of May 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay signed a treaty of alliance. Together, they had a population of roughly 11 million. Paraguay had about 500,000. The war lasted 5 years, and it did not go the way the numbers suggest it should have. Not at first. Paraguayan forces held the fortress at Humaita for 2 years. At Tuyuti in 1866, the two sides fought the largest pitched battle in South American history. But an army of 500,000 people cannot replace its losses against an army of 11 million. By January 1869, the Allies were in Asunción. Solano Lopez refused to surrender, moved into the hills, and kept the war going for another 14 months. By then, there were almost no adult men left to give him, so he took the others. On the 12th of August, 1869, the Allied army reached the town of Piribebui, where the government had relocated. The garrison holding it was made up largely of the wounded, the elderly, women, and boys. It held for 5 hours. Accounts of what followed described the town's hospital being set alight with wounded men inside it. 4 days later, the rear guard was ordered to hold a plane to buy time for the retreat. The 16th of August, 1869, a flat, open field called Acosta New, crossed by 2 shallow streams. General Bernardino Caballero has between 3,500 and 4,000 people under his command. Most of them are children. Some are as young as 9. Caballero has had false beards fixed to the faces of the youngest ones so that from a distance they might be taken for men. Facing them, 20,000 Brazilian and Argentine troops, most of them cavalry, on ground that could not be better suited to cavalry. The fighting begins at 8:30 in the morning and goes on for 8 hours. When it is over, Allied horsemen see figures moving away across the field and assume it is an organized withdrawal. It is not. It is women collecting the wounded. To stop anyone else escaping, they set fire to the grass. Around 2,000 Paraguayans died at Acosta New. The Allies lost 46 men. Since 1948, the 16th of August has been Children's Day in Paraguay. It is not celebrated so much as observed. Solano Lopez was run down and killed at Cerro Cora in the far north on the 1st of March, 1870. He is said to have declared as he died that he was dying with his country. He was closer to right than he knew. In 1871, the first reliable census was taken. Historians still argue about the pre-war figure and about the exact scale of the loss, and the range they argue over runs from roughly half the population to 2/3. What the census itself recorded is not in dispute. 221,000 people were left alive. 28,000 of them were men. The rest, around 150,000 women and 87,000 children, were what remained of a country. Argentina and Brazil annexed 140,000 square kilometers of its territory. Brazilian troops stayed as an occupying force for 6 more years. There was no state. There was no treasury. There was no army, no bureaucracy, no functioning school system, and for most practical purposes, there were no fathers. And this is the answer to the question the whole country poses. Spanish in Paraguay had always been the language of the institution, the court, the ministry, the garrison, the office where a man went to sign something. Every one of those institutions was destroyed or occupied. Guarani had always been the language of the house. The house was what was left. 4 in 5 surviving adults were women. They took the fields, the markets, the animals, the rebuilding, and the raising of the next generation. And they raised that generation the way they spoke, in the language their own mothers had used with them. For an entire cohort of Paraguayan children, there was no father in the house to bring the other language home from work. There was, in a great many houses, no work and no office and no other language at all. One of those women walked back into an emptied town called Itagua and started weaving again. And 300 motifs, and 150 years later, her craft is on the national calendar. Multiply her by 100,000, and you have the country. Paraguay recovered its population. It did not recover its politics. What came back over the following century was a sequence of coups, another war, and finally, in 1954, a general named Alfredo Stroessner, who held power for 35 years. And here the story turns, because the state that reassembled itself did not thank the language that had carried the country through. It punished it. Guarani was fine in the fields. It was not permitted in the classroom. Children caught speaking it at school were beaten. They were made to kneel on maize kernels or on salt for the morning. They were refused food and water for the day. In some schools, they were made to wear nappies in front of the class. David Galeano Oliveira, who now runs the institution that trains Guarani teachers in Paraguay, has described it directly, and he does not soften it. It was persecution carried out in public against small children for speaking the language they had learned at home. Stroessner's 1967 constitution named Guarani a national language. Only Spanish was made official. In 35 years in power, he never gave a single speech in it. So the sequence is this. The language survived a war that killed most of the population because the survivors were the people who spoke it. Then it survived the state that came back afterwards because the state could reach the classroom but never got into the kitchen.
Stroessner fell in February 1989.
The new constitution was ratified in June 1992, and it made Guarani co-official with Spanish for the first time in 450 years. The generation who were made to kneel on maize are now grandparents. Their grandchildren learn the language formally in school with textbooks from teachers trained to do it. There is a story the world tells about dying languages, and it is mostly wrong. The story says that languages die because they are unwritten, or because they are spoken by too few people, or because no institution stands behind them. Guarani was written down before English spelling was standardized. It was carried by a population reduced to 200,000 people. It had no state behind it for most of its recorded life, and for 35 years, the state worked against it. It is spoken today by more people than at any point in its history. The words it gave away, jaguar, tapir, piranha, toucan, maraca, are used daily on every continent by people who could not name the language they came from. And in 1932, an army sent its orders over an open radio channel in that same language, and nobody listening on the other end could read a word of it. A language does not survive because it is protected. It survives because of who is left holding it. There is a footnote to all of this, out in the Chaco, and it is an animal. In 1930, a scientist described a new species of peccary from fossil bones. Large, long-eared, 3 toes on the hind foot. It was catalogued and filed as extinct, a Pleistocene animal gone for thousands of years. Then, in the early 1970s, an American zoologist named Ralph Wetzel went into the Paraguayan Chaco to survey mammals. He found it walking around. His paper appeared in 1975 under a title that says everything: an extinct peccary alive in Paraguay. It had never been missing. The people who live in the Chaco had always known it. They call it the tagua. It eats cactus, spines and all, kicking the pads across the ground to break the needles off, and its long nose is built to filter the dust of the driest forest on the continent. Only the record had been wrong. There are perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 tagua left, and the number is falling because the forest they need is the forest being cleared. Being alive and being safe are not the same thing. Which is, in the end, the honest note to finish on. Paraguay did not save Guarani through good policy. It saved it by catastrophe and by 4 generations of women who had nothing else left to hand on. What has happened since is deliberate and worth listing because it is specific. A languages law in 2010 required the state to work in both tongues and public officials to be able to use them. A National Language Secretariat followed in 2011 and an Academy of the Guarani language in 2012 to settle spelling and vocabulary. Guarani is a working language of Mercosur. There are Guarani keyboards, Guarani encyclopedia entries, Guarani rap, and a literary archive that ran from the 1940s to the 1990s. More than 14,000 poems and songs in Guarani, Spanish, and Jopara has been digitized and published, the printed anthology titled with 3 Guarani words: My Word, My Song. But the thing that tells you the most is smaller than any of that, and it happens several million times a day. A thermos of iced water, herbs crushed in a wooden mortar by a woman at a market stall before dawn. This one for the stomach, this one for the heat, this one because your grandmother always used it. A cup, a metal straw, and a circle of people. One person pours, the cup goes round. You drink all of it every time and hand it back without speaking, and that is how they know you want another. It is called tereré, and in 2020 it became the first thing from Paraguay that UNESCO ever placed on its list of the living heritage of humanity. Nobody legislated it, nobody funded it. It is a set of rules that everybody knows and nobody was formally taught, passed from hand to hand in a language that was never supposed to make it this far. 10 kilometers from the Argentine border, there is a great unfinished church on a hill, and the Guarani name they gave it means what was going to be a town. They named it for what never happened. The language they named it in is spoken by 7 million people. Thank you for spending this time with us. If you would like to keep traveling, subscribe, and we will see you on the next journey.